On the morning of the 24th of April, 1951, 400 Australian soldiers were officially dead. Every American report confirmed it. An entire Chinese division had hit their position in the dark, and the generals tracking the battle from headquarters had written them off before sunrise. Nobody told the Australians. They were still fighting. That is the story nobody taught you in school. Not the casualty numbers, not the presidential citation, not the name of the hill. Just 400 men, cut off, surrounded, declared dead by their own allies, holding a Korean ridgeline through the longest night of their lives, while 60 kilometers to the south sat a city of 1 million people that would have fallen if those men had stopped. Tell me in the comments whether you have heard of the Battle of Kapyong before today, because what follows is the account of how 400 soldiers stopped an entire Chinese division, how one man ran a battle nobody knew he was running, and how the world forgot all of it within a decade. On the 25th of June, 1950, North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and shattered the Republic of Korea's defenses within days. The United Nations authorized a military response. 16 nations sent forces. Australia committed early, not because a treaty required it, but because the Menzies government understood what a communist-controlled Korean peninsula would mean for the balance of power in the Pacific. More than 18,000 Australians would eventually serve. 340 would not come home. By April of 1951, the war had already changed shape 3 times. Seoul had fallen and been recaptured and fallen again. China had entered the conflict in October of 1950 with a force so large it broke the advancing United Nations formations and drove them south in one of the worst retreats in Commonwealth military history. The conflict that seemed nearly finished in October was, by Christmas, something else entirely. A grinding, bitter contest along mountain ridgelines in temperatures that froze rifles and killed men who stopped moving. General Matthew Ridgway had stabilized the line and pushed north again through the first months of 1951. The momentum appeared to be running one way. Then on the 11th of April, President Truman relieved General MacArthur for publicly contradicting United States policies on the war's scope. A new commander, Lieutenant General James Van Fleet, arrived to lead the 8th Army on the 14th of April. He had been in Korea for 8 days when intelligence officers detected what they believed was the preliminary movement of a major Chinese offensive. The intelligence was correct about the offensive. It was catastrophically wrong about the scale. 337,000 Chinese troops were preparing to drive toward Seoul in the main thrust alone. 700,000 in total were about to move. The men in their path had 6 days' warning. Standing in the path of that advance, as April turned warm and the Korean hills filled with wild azaleas, were men who were gathering flowers for an Anzac Day ceremony. They were making wreaths. They had earned a rest. They had no idea what was coming up the valley. You need to understand what kind of men these were before you understand what they did. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, had arrived in Korea in September of 1950 in a condition that the Chief of the General Staff described privately as not fully battle-worthy. They had been living the soft life in Japan as part of the occupation force. Houseboys, cheap beer, black market earnings. The battalion was understrength, underarmed, and had spent 5 years since the Second World War practicing peacetime administration rather than combat. The assessment was fair. It would not stay fair for long. Within 30 days of North Korea's invasion, they were in combat. Over the 8 months that followed, they fought at Yongju, at the Apple Orchard, at Kujin, at Cheongju, at Pakchon. They advanced toward apparent victory, then retreated south through bitter cold, then ground their way north again. They learned what they had not been taught. They buried men they had trained alongside. The unit that arrived in Korea undertrained had become, by April of 1951, what the official history described as having achieved that smooth integration born of mutual confidence which is essential to the making of an outstanding combat unit. Their nickname was Old Faithful. It had been earned one engagement at a time. Their commanding officer at Kapyong, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson, had not been their original commander. Born the 13th of April, 1917, in Wellington, New Zealand, Ferguson had come to command through tragedy. His predecessor, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Green, had been resting in his tent after the Battle of Cheongju on the 8th of November, 1950, when a single Chinese artillery shell struck a tree above the canvas. One fragment came through. Green was mortally wounded by a single piece of shrapnel while he slept. Ferguson was promoted that same day and given command on the spot. He had been a cadet journalist before the war. He had enlisted in the Australian Army on the 3rd of November, 1939, served through the Middle East and New Guinea, won the Military Cross, and been mentioned in dispatches. His men discovered he would appear at any position in the line, humping mortar ammunition or inspecting a forward weapon pit, and produce a dry remark that made you want to do more for him. An American tank officer who fought alongside him would later write that bravery was routine to him. But Ferguson is not the man this story is really about. Major Bernard Shelley O'Dowd was born on the 2nd of June, 1918, in Perth, Western Australia. His father was an assistant government meteorologist by profession and an absence by every other measure. A gambler and a drunk, as O'Dowd would later describe him, without particular bitterness. O'Dowd and his sister were taken into state care when he was 4 years old. They were fostered to a First World War widow who needed someone to mow the lawn, chop the wood, feed the chickens, and on Saturday, kill one for Sunday's dinner. It was a house, he said, not a home. He left school at 14. He worked as a machinist, a cook, and eventually as a bogger, a pick and shovel man in the Kalgoorlie gold mines. He enlisted as a private on the 7th of November, 1939. Not an officer, not educated, not connected to anyone who could get him promoted, just a man from the mines who showed up and said he would go. What happened over the next decade is the kind of story that makes you realize how much talent the world buries under circumstance. He served with the 211th Battalion through the Middle East and New Guinea, accumulated combat knowledge that no staff college teaches, and by the Island Campaign was a warrant officer second class, commanding a platoon. The system that could not give him a military cross because of his enlisted rank gave him instead a member of the Order of the British Empire as a gallantry award. He was commissioned in the field. He attended the Royal Military College at Duntroon. He qualified for a regular commission. He joined the battalion in Japan at the outbreak of the Korean War and was promoted to temporary major on the 23rd of December, 1950, taking command of A Company. On the 4th of March, 1951, 6 weeks before Kapyong, O'Dowd was directing an attack in which 12 diggers died. He was standing beside a South Korean officer when a mortar barrage fell on their position. The South Korean was blown to pieces. O'Dowd took fragments in his left calf and his right lung. 3 weeks later, he was back in command of A Company. You do not become that kind of soldier by accident. You become it by choosing, over and over, to return. The other man you need to know is Captain Reginald Walter Saunders, born the 7th of August 1920 at Framlingham Aboriginal Reserve near Pernem in Victoria. Saunders was the first Aboriginal Australian to be commissioned as an officer in the Australian Army. The commissioning had required the paperwork to be sent all the way to the Commander-in-Chief for personal approval because of what the Army's administration described as its special significance. This was 1944. His father had served in the First World War. His uncle had won the Military Medal in France and been killed in action in 1918. His younger brother, Harry, had been killed in New Guinea in 1942. Saunders had been shot in the knee in a separate action, recovered, and returned to his unit. He re-enlisted for Korea in 1950. He commanded C Company at Kapyong. His biographer wrote that he was accepted unreservedly by the men who served with him, because false values do not flourish among frontline soldiers. 3 men, 3 completely different origins. 1 hill in Korea. 1 night that would determine whether Seoul fell or held. Now understand the ground they were asked to defend. The Kapyong Valley ran north to south, one of the traditional invasion corridors towards Seoul. Its floor was 1 to 2 kilometers wide, open and cultivated. On the eastern side, hills rose approximately 400 meters to the summit of Hill 504, assigned to the Australians. On the western side, the terrain climbed nearly 600 meters to Hill 677, assigned to the Canadian Battalion, the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel James Stone. To the northwest, Sudok-san climbed nearly 800 meters and was left unoccupied. There were no troops for it. Hill 504's summit was a steep-sided, narrow ridge. D Company made the long climb to the top, carrying weapons, ammunition, food, and communications equipment. A company took the spur line running northwest. C Company positioned on a rear spur. B Company occupied a smaller hill near the river, closest to the road in the valley floor. Ferguson's headquarters sat in a small gully south of the ford, where the road crossed the Kapyong River, 1.5 to 2 kilometers behind the forward companies, directly on the main approach route, with radio communications to the forward positions obstructed by the ridgelines between them. The brigade was holding a 7-kilometer front, with forces designed for half that distance. The position was fragile before the first Chinese soldier appeared. Most of the battalion believed they were simply occupying an overnight position before moving forward the next day. They were not. At 10:30, the night of the 22nd of April, the New Zealand Field Regiment operating further north received word that the Chinese had struck the South Korean 6th Division's right flank in force. The forward South Korean elements withdrew 5 kilometers in 30 minutes. Communications with them were lost by 11 o'clock. Within hours, the South Korean divisional headquarters was admitting the virtual disintegration of its forward elements. Intelligence Sergeant Colin McGregor of the Australian Battalion went across to the Korean headquarters to assess the situation and found the staff rapidly replacing their own formation markers with red arrows showing the advance of the Chinese. The headquarters did not stay long after that. The New Zealand guns withdrew before 4 in the morning, the sound of small arms audible immediately in front of one of their batteries. They redeployed south through a road already choked with South Korean soldiers moving in disorder. Drivers abandoned stalled vehicles. Men scrambled onto ox carts or joined the mass on foot. Equipment was shed as they went: rifles, packs, helmets, leaving the road littered with evidence of a formation that had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Within this torrent of retreating soldiers, almost impossible to identify in the darkness, were Chinese. The People's Volunteer Army had moved south with the collapsing formation, using the chaos of the retreat as cover, and had already penetrated the Australian position along the road before the main assault even began. The battle line that existed on maps in brigade headquarters no longer corresponded to anything on the actual ground. At 9:15, the night of the 23rd of April, a nearly full moon rose over the valley. It illuminated the hillsides, the road, the cultivated floor below, and everything moving on all of them. Both defenders and attackers could now see each other with brutal clarity. At 9:30, the Chinese struck the forward tank outpost, 5 American Sherman tanks positioned north of B Company to prevent enemy use of the road. The attack was repelled. An hour later, a much heavier assault fell on the same position. Lieutenant D. Martino, the tank platoon commander, was mortally wounded, along with 3 of his tank commanders. The tankers had been fighting with hatches open, the only way to observe infiltrators attempting to close with the vehicles, but without accompanying infantry to protect them from close approach. DiMartino gave the withdrawal order before he died. Lieutenant Young, the second in command of B Company, heard the engines start. He ran down to the road to stop the withdrawal before he had time to think about what he was running toward. He forgot to take a weapon. By the time he reached the road, the last tank was already moving past him. He persuaded the commander to stop, promised to send the wounded crew members rearward and bring ammunition forward, and walked ahead of the tank in the moonlight to guide it back into position. Shadows moved beside the road. Young called out a Korean phrase meaning, "Come here," thinking they were stragglers. The answer was a grenade. He went for the ditch. The explosion burst harmlessly on the road surface. Chinese soldiers ran over him in the dark, chasing the tank that had reversed its speed. More grenades landed near the ditch. They singed his mustache and his hair, and did nothing else. He lay still until the sounds of pursuit faded south. Then he got up and walked back to his company. Somewhere in the darkness, Captain Girk of Headquarters Company sent men to check on the American heavy mortar unit that was supposed to be providing fire support nearby. They came back with a report that required a moment to absorb. The position was deserted. The mortars were still on the ground. 50 vehicles sat packed and apparently ready to move. The men were gone. The entire company had abandoned its equipment and fled 16 kilometers to the east. Every one of the 50 vehicles was recovered from the paddy fields the following day. Gurkha drove one out himself. The main assault began at 12:50 in the morning. It fell first on B Company's 4 platoon on the small hill near the river. The Australians inflicted heavy casualties and drove the attack back. A second assault came at 3:30 in the morning against the company's southern flank, accompanied by a feint on the opposite side. The Chinese penetrated the perimeter. Counterattacks by tank and infantry drove them back out. A final push just before dawn, 70 Chinese, was repelled. When full daylight arrived, the men of B Company counted 173 enemy dead on their perimeter and in the valley below. 173. From one company position, in one night. A company had endured something categorically different. Not 3 attacks separated by pauses, but a continuous assault that intensified as the night progressed. The Chinese advanced with bugle calls, guided by bold, non-commissioned officers who moved along the attacking line, pointing grenade throwers to the most effective angles. The defenders identified and killed these leaders. Others immediately stepped forward to replace them. All 3 Bren gunners of one platoon were killed or wounded. Platoon strength fell from 30 men to 13. There was barely time between successive assaults to pull the wounded back and redeploy the survivors to cover the resulting gaps. At 1 in the morning, O'Dowd ordered the remnants of one platoon to consolidate behind company headquarters. The enemy did not pause to observe the reorganization. Attacks continued until 4:30 in the morning. By full light, a company had taken 50 casualties. While the forward companies fought for their ridgelines, Ferguson was conducting a completely separate battle for the survival of his own headquarters. The Chinese, moving south inside the torrent of retreating South Koreans, had surrounded the headquarters position before 10 in the evening and cut the road to the south. The defenders were struck by attacking waves and driven from the high ground they had been holding. 2 men from the machine gun section were killed. Lieutenant Evans directed one of the American tanks to fire on the roadblock and on houses in the nearby village, from which Chinese soldiers were shooting at the headquarters. Tank crew reported 40 enemy killed in one house alone. Private John Godden of the mortar platoon lay through the entire night in a creek bed with a Bren gun, next to one of the American tanks. Every 20 minutes, the tank commander opened his hatch and called down into the darkness, "Are you still there, Ozzy?" On one occasion, Godden's reply came up clearly. "For Christ's sake, don't make a noise. That is what the night sounded like. That is who was holding the line." From the moment the headquarters came under assault, O'Dowd was the senior functioning commander of the forward battle, Ferguson was separated from his companies by terrain and by the enemy force controlling the road between them. Telephone lines had been cut. Radio communication was obstructed by the ridgelines. There were no orders to receive because there was no functioning chain of command to issue them. O'Dowd did not wait for permission. He was in command in the way that circumstances rather than documents establish command. The only officer with a coherent picture of the forward situation. The only officer whose radio could reach all 4 companies. The only officer positioned to coordinate what happened next. The Battle of Kapyong, from approximately 10 in the evening of the 23rd of April forward, was run by a man who had left school at 14 and enlisted as a private. Dawn came on the 24th of April as gray light spreading across the ridges, and it brought a discovery that the night had not finished its business. A company's morning revealed Chinese machine gunners established in the gap between platoon positions on the upper ridge. They were firing down onto the Australians below. Corporal Evelet led a patrol down the spur at 6 in the morning, came over a false crest, found the infiltrators without warning, and attacked immediately. 6 Chinese killed for the loss of 1 Australian. The threat was removed. By 7 o'clock, after a night and half a morning of continuous fighting, a company was back on its original position. The Chinese were now withdrawing across open ground, under observation from the heights. O'Dowd described what he saw with the dry precision that characterized everything he said about combat. The situation rather resembled sitting in the middle of a wheat field at dawn, potting rabbits, as they dashed hither and thither. Then he picked up the radio. Seeing a fresh wave of Chinese advancing up the valley, O'Dowd directed his operator to contact anyone available for fire support. The American 1st Marine Division answered. The operator refused to accept that he was talking to an Australian because Australian forces had been reported destroyed the night before. O'Dowd took the radio himself. He demanded to speak to the commanding general. The general came on the line and told O'Dowd his unit no longer existed. Confirmed destroyed. Every report said so. Private Patrick Knowles was standing close enough to hear both sides of the exchange. O'Dowd's reply, as Knowles recorded it. "I've got news for you. We are still here, and we are staying here." This was not a dramatic moment. It was an operational report. A company had repelled continuous assault from midnight until dawn, suffered 50 casualties, counterattacked at first light, and reoccupied its start line. The general's intelligence was wrong. O'Dowd's knowledge was correct. The battalion existed. We are still here, and we are staying here. Remember that line, because it is everything. D Company on Hill 504's summit had been under sustained attack since 7 in the morning. 12 platoon at the forward edge was assaulted at 30-minute intervals by Chinese coming up a slope so steep the attacking front could be no wider than 4 or 5 men. In the first 6 assaults, the Chinese lost approximately 30 killed. The New Zealand guns delivered accurate fire within 50 meters of the Australian positions throughout. Every round had to count. The gunners had been trucking shells from as far as Seoul, 60 kilometers south, because the simultaneous battle on the Imjin River, where British Gloucesters were being encircled and destroyed, had depleted the forward ammunition stocks. Ferguson, his adjutant, and the medical officer rode forward on American tanks to resupply the isolated companies and evacuate the wounded. Ferguson crouched in the gunloader's seat of the lead tank. His adjutant settled onto the floor with the radio, and at some point during the mission fell asleep. When the tanks came under fire, Ferguson learned the mechanics of loading tank ammunition so that the driver could return fire without leaving the controls. 16 Australian wounded were brought back in 2 round trips. The Chinese, on both journeys, refrained from shooting at the tanks, carrying wounded on their decks. Ferguson walked among his men at the forward positions under fire, so calm that the American tank officer Miller wrote afterward that he acted like he was in total command of the situation and that his organization would triumph. At 1:30 in the afternoon, a lull allowed Captain Grosvenor to pull the forward platoon back to a tighter perimeter. The movement was executed, while Chinese mortars continued firing on the now vacated position. A Chinese assault force that had been assembling to attack then launched its charge against empty ground. Grosvenor's company watched from the ridge and applied heavy fire. The New Zealand artillery struck the same area. Grosvenor then called for an airstrike. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, 2 American Corsair aircraft dropped their napalm directly into D Company's defenses. A spotting aircraft had accidentally marked the Australian position. The Corsairs attacked the marked coordinates. The napalm struck 10 platoon and company headquarters. 2 Australians died. Others burned. The dry scrub on the summit caught immediately, and fires moved across the position. Wounded men who could not move burned where they lay. Private Winson, the company radio operator, ran into the fire to pull out the commander's radio set. Without that radio, Grosvenor would later assess, the subsequent withdrawal could not have been coordinated. Captain Ryan ran out under fire, waving the identification panel at the pilots. Lieutenant Miller, watching from the valley below, sent messages through American communications to halt the attack. The airstrike stopped. The fires kept burning. The Chinese on the eastern flank hit 11 platoon immediately, exploiting the chaos. The platoon threw them back. The defenders were now fighting on 3 fronts at once. Ferguson's options were 3. Hold through another night in current positions. A company had 50 casualties it could not evacuate. D Company had just lost men to friendly fire. Ammunition was critically low, and another night at the same intensity would produce the same result until there was no one left. Push reinforcements through to the companies. A Middlesex company had already been ordered forward and turned back when it encountered Chinese controlling the approach roads. Or withdraw while daylight and ammunition remained. Lose the ground. Bring back the men. Ferguson chose the third option and gave the order to O'Dowd by radio. His exact words were overheard by the Canadian Battalion commander on Hill 6717. "Withdraw as best you can to the Middlesex positions. I can no longer keep control." O'Dowd began planning. 4 rifle companies spread across separate ridgelines, under active enemy pressure, carrying 50 wounded men, with 39 Chinese prisoners, who knew enough about the battalion to be a security risk if released. O'Dowd had momentarily forgotten the prisoners in the intensity of planning. When Captain Laughlin of B Company asked what to do with them, O'Dowd said to bring them. They proved more useful than expected. The prisoners helped carry Australian wounded on stretchers. They carried equipment. They gave no trouble through the entire movement. The withdrawal was a leapfrog in reverse. 1 company holding a blocking position facing north, 1 company moving to the next, bound along the ridge. 1 company preparing the position after that. Then the rear company moving through the one that just held. The sequence repeating until all 4 companies reached the river. B Company moved first. Then C Company at 4:30 in the afternoon. Then A. Then D Company could not leave at the scheduled time. Another assault hit the summit just as the withdrawal began. Chinese infantry ran at the forward weapon pits to overrun the position before the Australians could break contact. 10 platoon held while the rest of the company moved. Then, 10 platoon began its own withdrawal. In this rapid sequence, 1 man was left behind. Private Keith Gwither had been alone in his pit when a shell landed close to his parapet. The concussion knocked him unconscious. The explosion collapsed the pit sides around him. His partner, a Bren gunner who had left to investigate something, never came back. Gwither regained consciousness hours later in complete darkness. Only his head was above the ground. Chinese soldiers were digging positions around him. When they saw him trying to reach his water bottle, they dug him out. His family in Australia received no confirmation that he was alive until the Chinese released a prisoner list on the 24th of December, 1951. For the companies moving south along the ridge and gathering darkness, the New Zealand artillery was the difference between a withdrawal and an annihilation. Shells fell within 50 meters of the rearguard throughout the entire movement. The accuracy required to place artillery that close to your own men demands a level of trust that takes months to build between gunners and infantry. Captain Saunders wrote after the action, "As the rearguard moved south, Chinese troops were right behind them, and many a Chinaman had a dead heat or a photo finish with a 25-pounder Kiwi shell. Sometimes the Chinaman won, and sometimes only came second. In the darkness, 2 platoons of A Company became separated and descended to the river at the wrong crossing point. They turned west along the bank, following the water toward the ford. The Chinese pursuing them did not follow this sudden change of direction and continued south into the river. The Canadians on Hill 607, detecting movement in the water, opened fire. The Australians had already turned west. No one was hit. Lieutenant Young, the same man who had walked unarmed ahead of a tank down a moonlit road the night before, stood now on the enemy side of the ford in complete darkness, waiting for the last companies to cross. He waited as long as he could. When his last man was 80 meters back into safe territory, he finally began to follow. He looked back and saw 2 columns of men starting across the water, the separated platoons. He waited until they were through. By 11:30 on the night of the 24th of April, all elements of the battalion had reported in. Ferguson stood at a checkpoint on the road and verified each group as it arrived. It was Anzac Eve. The ceremony with the Turkish brigade, the wreaths woven from wild azaleas, the first bath in weeks, all of it had given way to this. Saunders wrote afterward, "At last I felt like an Anzac, and I imagine there were 600 others like me. The weight of the Chinese offensive shifted west that same night. The Canadians on Hill 677 absorbed sustained attacks through the early hours of Anzac Day. The New Zealanders fired 10,000 rounds of 25-pound ammunition in support of the Canadians during those hours alone. When Chinese attackers penetrated one of the Canadian company positions, the company commander requested the guns fire on his own location while his men took cover. The request was granted. The shelling cleared the position. The Canadians held. By mid-afternoon on the 25th of April, the approach road had been cleared, and the Canadians were relieved by American troops. On Anzac Day, 1951, the Australians rested. Now hear what it cost. 32 Australians killed, 59 wounded, 3 captured. The Canadian battalion lost 10 killed and 23 wounded. Chinese casualties in the Kapyong sector are not established in the historical record with precision. At B Company's position alone, 173 enemy dead were counted. The total across the full engagement was certainly in the hundreds. By the 1st of May, the first effort of the Chinese 5th Phase offensive was spent. After Kapyong, the Chinese made only one further attempt to break through United Nations lines, and were stopped by American forces. The 38th parallel held. Ceasefire talks began in July of 1951, less than 3 months after the battle. Military instructors at defense academies would later describe Kapyong as the perfect defensive battle. The United States Presidential Unit Citation, awarded to the battalion on the 26th of June, 1951, said the soldiers had displayed such gallantry, determination, and esprit de corps as to set them apart and above other units participating in the campaign. Ferguson received the Distinguished Service Order. The American tank commander received both the United States Distinguished Service Cross and the British Military Cross. The battalion received its citation. O'Dowd received nothing for Kapyong. Let that sit for a moment. The man who ran the forward battle from the moment the headquarters was overrun through the last platoon crossing the river. The man who coordinated 4 companies under simultaneous assault across multiple ridgelines without orders from above and without a functioning link to his commanding officer. the man who planned and executed the withdrawal of those same companies, carrying their wounded and 39 prisoners across dark and rugged terrain without losing a single additional soldier. That man received no decoration from the action. His fellow officer, Brigadier Lou Brumfield, wrote in O'Dowd's obituary, "In the minds of the soldiers, there was no doubt that O'Dowd had fought the battle and brought the battalion to safe haven. The lack of recognition for Ben has always rankled with Kapyong veterans. 3 Australians did not cross the river that night, and their stories are the part of Kapyong that the citations could not measure." Private Horace William Madden was born on the 14th of February, 1924, at Cronulla in Sydney. 6 feet and half an inch tall, slight in build. The name Slim was earned from his frame. He had served in New Guinea, gone to Japan with the occupation force, joined the battalion as a driver in November of 1950, and volunteered to become a linesman in the signals platoon, maintaining communications in below-freezing temperatures across terrain that punished wire as efficiently as it punished men. During the night battle, he was concussed by enemy fire. In the chaos of the headquarters withdrawal, he was left behind. He was surrounded and taken prisoner. In captivity, Madden refused to cooperate with Chinese and North Korean attempts to use him for propaganda. He was beaten repeatedly. He was deprived of food as punishment. He remained cheerful. He shared what food he had with prisoners in worse condition, and he understood what that generosity would eventually cost him. He grew steadily weaker through months at the bean camp, and then at a collection of tunnels the prisoners called the Caves at Kangdong. In late October of 1951, the Chinese marched the sick and wounded to a new location, 225 kilometers away. Madden collapsed and was carried by cart. He survived the journey. He died of malnutrition sometime between late November and early December, 1951. He was 27 years old. His fellow prisoner Keith Gwither said of him, "Slim was a real hero and didn't know it. He became a sort of legend. He didn't try to be like that. It was just the way he was made." Slim Madden was posthumously awarded the George Cross, the highest award for conduct other than direct combat, equivalent in standing to the Victoria Cross. His remains were reburied in the United Nations Memorial Cemetery in Busan. Private Robert Parker, the dispatch rider shot from his motorcycle who buried his Owen gun in the mud rather than surrender it, survived the bean camp and a failed escape attempt that left him 11 days on raw vegetables, bran, and salt before recapture. He was released on the 6th of August, 1953. Gwither, dug from a collapsed pit by the men who then took him prisoner, survived 2 escape attempts and more than 2 years of captivity. He was released 3 days after Parker. The war that produced these men and these acts was called almost immediately the Forgotten War. It fell between the Second World War that preceded it, whose scale and moral clarity had shaped a generation, and the Vietnam War that followed, whose domestic disruption would define another. Korea ended not in victory or defeat, but in an armistice along a line that roughly approximated the border where the fighting had begun. 3 years of war for a border that already existed. No parades followed, no national reckoning, just grief and silence, and men coming home to a country that had already moved on. Reg Saunders came home to an Australia in which Aboriginal people would not receive full citizenship rights for another 16 years. The man accepted unreservedly by every soldier who served with him in combat, found a different country when the uniform came off. He was ineligible for the soldier settlement scheme that granted land to returned servicemen. He worked as a tram conductor, a foundry worker, a shipping clerk. He resigned his commission in 1954. He eventually found his purpose at the Office of Aboriginal Affairs, spending his remaining working years fighting for his people, with the same quiet directness he had brought to the ridge at Kapyong. He died in March of 1990. The RSL established a scholarship in his name 2 years later. It continues today. O'Dowd served in the Malayan Emergency, became Deputy Commander of Australia's Jungle Training Centre, retired from the Army, and spent a decade building the Victorian State Emergency Services into a functioning institution. He married Army nurse Marie Stevens in 1954 and had 9 children. In 2001, on the 50th anniversary of Kapyong, he published his memoir of the Korean War. He described the first 8 months of the battalion's experience with the specific, undramatic precision of a man who had been there and saw no reason to embellish what needed no embellishment. He died on the 29th of February, 2012, at the age of 93. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, carries Kapyong on its colors today. The annual Kapyong Day ceremony is held on the 24th of April at Laverack Barracks in Townsville. South Korean officials attend every year. The nickname Old Faithful is on the color patch of every soldier who serves in the battalion. The Royal Australian Mint issued a commemorative coin for the 75th anniversary of the battle, featuring 32 poppies on its face, one for each Australian killed. Here is what you need to carry away from this story. 400 men held a Chinese division, not because they were ordered to die in place, not because they had no other choice, because they had spent 8 months learning how to be exactly the kind of soldiers that moment required, and when the moment came, they were ready. One man ran that battle without a single order from above, without recognition afterward, and without complaint about either. He just did what needed doing, and then went home and built something else. The generals got the medals. The battalion got the citation. The man who ran the battle got his men home alive. He said that was enough. His soldiers disagreed. They are still disagreeing in the obituaries they write for each other 50 years later. If your family carries this history, if you had someone on Hill 504, or in the Kapyong Valley, or among the men of Old Faithful, say so in the comments. This story belongs to the people who lived it, and to the people who carry it forward. On the 24th of April each year, the battalion parades and remembers the Anzac Day that could not happen in 1951 and became something else entirely. The hills above Kapyong are quiet now. The men who held them were not.